So I asked you to compile a list, to brainstorm a list that is focusing on objects that we use on a regular basis. Maybe we use on a daily basis. Maybe we use all the time, but we don't really think a whole lot about how they look or about anything more than we just use them and we kind of move on. Okay. So these are some of the examples of objects that we came up with. We're going to use the brainstorm list that you came up with at the end of the presentation today. We're going to kind of compile them all, so hold on to those. All right. Is there anything that you can see that these objects have in common, besides the fact that they're pretty common objects and we don't normally really think about how they look?
They're mostly used in the home.
They're mostly used in the home. So home is probably one of the more common places where we encounter these types of objects. Anything else that you notice?
They have a specific use for them.
They definitely have a specific function, okay? And that makes sense when we think about ordinary objects that we do encounter on a regular basis. It's usually stuff that is going to have a particular function. It's going to do something or perform a particular job, right? Hooligan, you with us?
Yeah.
Pick your head up, please. What else do you notice?
It's all something. You don't have to have anything, just something.
So there's not a lot of really anything special about them, right? Okay. Would you agree that these objects are not really designed to look good? Like that's not their main purpose in life, to be something that's pretty or to be something that you would choose to look at, right? You talked about them having a function. We talked about them having a particular use in our home. So these are made usually for a specific purpose, not to be particularly beautiful or particularly nice or fun looking, right? Agreed? Okay. So why are we thinking about that? Why is that something that we're focusing on with art? Okay. There have been some artists in the past. Jim Dine is one of them. He was an American pop artist. So if you think back to what you learned about pop art in 5th grade, if you went to Rockledge here, there's actually a pretty good chance. Is there a pretty good chance that I was your teacher? Maybe not. But I used to teach 5th grade at Rockledge with art. And we talked about pop art, and we talked about the idea that it showed everyday objects in kind of a new way. People were starting in that time period that pop art was popular, no pun intended. It started about the 50s, 1950s. People started to pay more attention to things that were a little bit more commonplace in a way that became visual, became something that was intended to be looked at. Think about, if you remember, like Andy Warhol and the soup cans. Remember the Campbell's soup can art? That was, not only was he using like a really common object, but he was repeating it over and over and over and over again, kind of to create a pattern. I don't know what you guys did when you were in 5th grade, but yes, sir?
So you just drew a Campbell's soup can?
He printed it. Actually, he did several different versions. So there were some that he printed. There was also some that were kind of just a whole bunch. It was almost like a grid of them, and each one had like a different flavor written down. So there were ones that he drew each soup can, and there were ones that he kind of printed and made kind of copies that way. What does that make you do as a viewer when you see something that's pretty common but repeated over and over and over again? What does that make you do?
It draws to your eyes.
Yeah, it draws your eye. It's going to make you look at it. It's going to make you pay more attention to it than you would if you just opened up your cabinet and you saw a Campbell's soup can, right? Okay, and isn't that the whole point of what we're doing, is that we're kind of drawing more attention, no pun intended, to things that normally maybe we don't pay enough attention to or don't pay much attention to. So Jim Dine was one of those, like very much in the style of Andy Warhol. And he used objects that he had some personal experiences with. And then he wanted to show with his art, he wanted to show what he called like a sensory experience. So what are our 5 senses? You can see, right, obviously. What are the other ones? Hear, taste, touch, smell. Okay, yep, and seeing was the first one. So in here, if we kind of like dissect this art a little bit, it's ink on paper, right? So it's not a lot of color, it's just one color of ink, and it was on just a, pretty straightforward piece of paper. There's no color, obviously. There is some value. We see some dimensionality in there. But do you see how the kind of like gritty style, that kind of like scratchy back and forth texture feels appropriate for a tool? Does that make sense to you? Okay. We talked about the different senses. Smell was one of them. Think about, any of you guys have like a toolbox, or you have a basement, like an area in your garage or in your basement where there's like a bunch of tools. Think about how that area smells. It has like that like dirty metal smell, like things have been used and then put away. Certainly, I'm trying to think of like my dad's tool area in his basement. It always had that kind of smell, like you could smell the metal of the tools, you could smell like nails and maybe scrap wood or scrap metal. So there were sensory experiences that I would associate with an area like that or with a memory like that. And that was kind of what he was going for. So he wanted that tool to kind of come across as like that gritty, you can almost kind of feel the grit, you can almost kind of smell that metallic kind of tool smell. Does that make sense? Okay. I think that this is an interesting example. I'm going to show you these. Okay, now this bridges the gap a little bit. Obviously the camera's not going to see it, but you guys can obviously see that we have our still life set up in the middle of the room, and that's what drawing and painting is working on right now. The project that we're going to do, the Ordinary Object Project, is kind of like building up and leading up to what you guys will be doing with still life in drawing and painting. And so these are some examples from, I don't know if the camera can see these a little bit. These are some examples from my husband's uncle, okay? And he is a fine artist. That's his profession, that's his job. He concentrates on still life type subjects. And so these were some little studies that he painted. A study is basically kind of like a thumbnail or a rough draft. It's a way to kind of create a smaller version that's a little bit quicker and a little bit less developed in order for an artist to practice, in order for an artist to kind of work some things out compositionally, or to work on colors and values and things like that. And he did a whole series that these were kind of an early part of with still life paintings of tools. And the tools that he was using were his father's. And so he kind of was drawing on, no pun intended again, the memories of how he experienced his dad using those tools, how he experienced just his dad having those tools, just kind of like we talked about the smell of a garage or the smell of a basement, things like that. And he used that subject as a way to kind of celebrate and a way to kind of remember and create, a visual experience out of some of the memories he had with his dad. So Jim Dine is kind of doing something similar in that he's trying to suggest something that's a little bit more meaningful than just, a wrench or pliers or whatever that is. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, here's another one. This one is called Red Beard. Okay. What do we notice about the title?
It's pretty much just about like the paintbrush and how it looks like an actual beard.
So he's comparing the paintbrush to a human characteristic like a beard, right? So do you think that that's going to suggest a little bit more meaning for this paintbrush? So it's not just any paintbrush, but he's the artist is suggesting that it has some sort of human characteristics. Anytime you attach human characteristics to an object, that kind of elevates it in meaning. It kind of makes you pay a little bit more attention. And I think it's pretty cool that even though this is from 1973, and even though it's a print, okay, it's an etching print, meaning that there was I'm assuming a copper plate that was etched into, it was made little grooves in, and then they ink the plate and they press it really, really firmly in a printing press on the paper, and that's how prints are made. So even though it's a print, meaning that there's multiple copies of this piece of art, it still was estimated to get $2,500 to $3,500 at auction. Okay, so this type of art, this kind of ordinary object, pop art style, still is pretty valuable. It's still pretty relevant in what we see in the art world today. This is Rene Magritte. Rene Magritte is very, very famous for his style of surrealism. So we talked about pop art with Jim Dine and the pliers that he called hammer and the red beard. Now we're talking about surrealism, which is a different style of art, coincidentally also one that we learned about at Rockledge in 5th grade. But this one, he's talking about the idea, it's called treachery of images. What does treachery mean? Is it a positive or a negative thing? Negative, right? It's not such a good thing, treachery. Does anybody speak French? Anybody know what that says? It's talking about the pipe.
I think I know what it says.
You think you know? You want to guess?
It says Seki Nest Pas Une Pipe.
Yep. So the translation of that into English is, this is not a pipe. So what do you think that means? It's a painting of a pipe that says this is not a pipe. What's his point?
It's not a pipe?
Okay, what does that mean? It's a painting of a pipe. So no matter how realistic you can get that paint, no matter how good you can get those highlights and shadows, no matter how smooth you can blend those value transitions, it's still only going to be a picture. Okay? And even, I mean, that's from 1929, so that was even before pop art, right? But think about how many things in our day and age right now where we see images in the media, we see things on advertisements, we see things in magazines or on the internet, and it's one thing to see the image of something, but it's quite another to experience it or to hold that thing or to see it in real life, right? Think about, like I'm thinking of the images that we see on the news when there are wars or terrorist attacks or violent situations, and we oftentimes will see images of that. But I bet if we were there in person, it would be a totally different experience, right? And so the idea here that he is talking with, Rene Magritte, is the idea that we have to kind of separate what we see in images, even from 1929, before social media. We have to separate the idea of what we see in images from what is actually real and what we experience in real life. Those are two very different things. And that's kind of what surrealism was focusing on. The idea that it can look real, but that doesn't mean that it is real. Okay? And that's even more, I mean, this is 1958 now, so this is starting to get into pop art, the time period, right? But even still, right, we oftentimes have to question what we see on TV. We have to question what we see in movies. There's CGI now. There's really good technology CGI that looks pretty believable, right? And so we have to question those types of things that we see before we can believe them, okay? So can you see the kind of influence in pop art, or the influence that pop art is having on surrealism now, using a common object, like an apple, okay? They're using it in a way that is obviously unrealistic, right? Because we wouldn't have an apple that like takes up the entire space of a room, okay? So that's kind of where surrealism and pop art kind of cross over a little bit. We're seeing that using still a common object, but using it in a way that kind of makes you think. Does that make sense? You guys have questions so far? You had a hand up back there. Was there a question or did I answer it already? All good? Okay. Okay, so here's a different artist. This is Pete Mondrian. This is from 1912, so this is the earliest so far of what we've seen. And he is working with, he calls this the gray tree, appropriate enough. He's working with a limited amount of color, obviously just black and white. And he's also working with a very, very loose style, very loose brushwork. This is not a realistic tree, would you agree? Okay, so if we think back to what we saw of Rene Magritte, Rene Magritte painted in a very surrealist way, very tight brush strokes, very smooth. He wanted things to look as realistic as he could, okay? Whereas Mondrian here is going for like very stylized approach. We know that it's a tree, but we also know that it's a kind of abstract version of a tree. It's a very stylized version of that tree. It's meant to kind of look broadly like a tree, but obviously we know that that's not the realistic version, right? And in art, we can do that. And that's what's really cool about paintings. And as you guys figured out with your brushwork and your textures and your color blending, you can do a lot with paint that doesn't have to simulate real life. And that's what's cool about paint that's different than, say, something like shading pencils or colored pencils or something that's a little bit tighter of a medium. Okay? So thinking about color and contrast, these are both two subjects that we would see on a regular basis, right? But they are presented in a way that makes us look a little bit further, that makes us look a little bit longer in a different way, makes it a little bit more visually interesting.
There's the one on the left, the toilet.
It is a toilet on the left, yes. So what did they do with this toilet? This is Kristen Miazzo. What did this artist do with this toilet? How did they present that toilet so that it is a little bit more visually interesting?
It's like a gold color, and they have like light colors towards like the middle part of it.
Mhm.
To make it look shiny.
So there's a lot of light colors in the middle, and they have kind of a goldish tone or tint to them. And then as it goes towards the outside, it gets much darker, and that makes it appear shiny, okay? But that's a lot of, would you agree that it's a lot exaggerated from what we would see in real life? Okay, so those highlights and shadows are probably there in real life, right? Toilets are shiny. We see shiny parts of them. We also see shadows because it's a three-dimensional object that has, light falling on it. But it's very, very exaggerated from the real version that we would see in real life. Okay, those of you that struggle a little bit to, if you were looking at a reference picture and you wanted to paint it and you can't really get it to match up, you're going to like this project because we don't want it to be an exact copy of that reference picture. We want to exaggerate things. We want things to look a little bit more what we call painterly, where we can see brush strokes and we can see that it's a piece of art, not a photograph, right? So what do we notice about the sewer cover? Yeah.
It's different colors than what you would expect.
Different colors than what we would expect in real life. Well said, yes. So clearly we know that sewer in real life is not bright yellow and doesn't have a really, kind of royal electric blue color in the shadows. And the pavement around it probably doesn't have pink and red and orange speckles on it. Okay, so it's manipulated in some artful ways in order to make it more interesting. Do you agree that this is probably more interesting than a sewer cover you would see walking down the street? I think so. Okay, all right. So when we do our ordinary objects, we do not have to use realistic or traditional colors. That's a little bit different than when you get to drawing and painting, when you're going to want to try to get as close as you can to the realistic colors that are there. This gives you a lot more freedom to kind of choose whatever colors you want, as long as you still have your highlights and your shadows kind of approximated so that we still can understand and recognize what that object is, okay? Another thing to think about is the brush strokes and the painting style, okay? So something I said before, we'll see if you picked it up, is we're not making photos. We're doing this as a painting for a reason, okay? Paint has those loose brush strokes kind of just inherently and naturally, right? You don't have to work too hard to get brush strokes. It just kind of happens. So it's a really nice project because it doesn't put a lot of pressure on you to make it look neat or to make it look particularly well blended, right? I'm not expecting you all to paint at the level of Rene Magritte with his, green apple or the pipe where it looks photorealistic, okay? I'm not expecting that. Paint is about being loose, and it's called painterly for a reason because it has those kind of loose brush strokes, okay? Let's take a look at the balance though. We just finished a project using balance, right? We talked about repeating colors in different parts. We talked about using active composition, meaning like diagonal lines and things like that that move our viewer's eye around. What do we see in either of these examples that shows us that the artist tried to balance something out visually? What are some techniques that these artists used?
On the French press one, like how it's like, I don't know if it's supposed to be like an umbrella or something in.
This, the lid part?
Oh, it's a lid.
Yep.
It has like the same like circular like rings to it as like the drink or whatever it is.
Yes.
And it's like the same size.
Same shape and same approximate size, right? So she's talking about these kind of circular patterns and textures, and they're similar, right? They're not the same, but they're very, very similar both in texture and in shape and in size to these parts down here. So because that's repeated, that creates a feeling of balance. Are there other things that you guys see? Julian, paying attention? That was nice of him. You should thank him. Other things that you guys see?
Kind of like a big fusion, I guess.
What?
A big fusion. Like you're
How
trying-
so?
Like you're trying to decipher what you want to left and what you want to right.
Okay, so they're not presented in a way where it's super obvious right away what it is, right? It takes you a second to kind of figure it out. Now that's important because we don't want it so obscure that we can't tell what it is. We want it to be recognizable. That's kind of part of the allure of what we're doing. But they're presented in a way that's unusual for that type of object, right? All right. How about, let's look at this one for a second. These are brush strokes that look very similar to a lot of the type of strokes that you guys use. I'm looking at this shape over here, this kind of orange, what I'm presuming is bar of soap. Yep. How did this artist, Brian Forrest, how did that artist balance out that bar of soap? It's going off the page, so it's going to carry more visual weight because remember that seesaw effect? So because it's so far over towards that side, it's going to carry more visual weight. How did this artist balance it out though? How did it make it feel balanced and not just like it's so visually dominant over on that one side? It's subtle, you gotta look carefully.
Oh, what is the one on the right side?
This is a faucet.
Oh.
So like this is like a sink and this is a faucet, like a top view down.
Oh, okay.
What is the black in the corner?
This is part of the signature of the artist. So like they signed the work. This is the same artist for both paintings.
Is it like the top part? Like, I don't know what that is.
You're talking about this up here?
Yeah.
Not specifically, but it helps, right? So we have something going off the edge on this side. It helps that we have something kind of almost going off the edge on the top, so that feels like it's not the only thing going off the edge.
And like the crack looking thing on the left side of it.
You're getting closer.
So the spot just under the crack,
It has to do with this, yes. And what color is this?
same color as the soap.
It's the same color as the soap, okay? So that has orange in it, okay? So does this. See these little traces of orange here? There's little traces of orange down here. There's even little traces of orange up here. They're not really like hit you over the head obvious, but they're subtle. And because those little traces of orange are in multiple places, it helps it feel like it belongs. Just like you guys repeated colors of the same shape, or shapes of the same color, on different parts of your canvas with abstract balance. Does that make sense? So you're going to use the same techniques, it's just kind of in a more subtle way, okay? You're not making like the exact same shape, or you're not even making, similar shapes. You're not going to use any masking tape to mask off shapes this time. But you are going to repeat colors, even if it's just like a subtle way to kind of blend it in. that, you're gonna do the same, where you're blending colors as you paint, and you're not painting with just one color at a time, you're actually blending kind of as you go on your canvas. Does that make sense? Okay. Here's some other examples of ways to use unrealistic color, and even the proportions here are unrealistic, right? These are not the right size and shapes of these people's faces, right? But we can still tell who they are. So even if your proportions, when you paint these objects, even if your proportions are not exactly correct, which I'm not expecting that they would be, we still can have it be a recognizable object because the highlights and the shadows let us know what that object is and how those dimensions really kind of play out in real life. Does that make sense? Okay, if you don't get anything else from this today, that is what I need you to understand.
Who are they?
Who are they? This is Mick Jagger. This is Arnold Schwarzenegger.
I could tell
That's a
those.
tree.
Wow.
Okay? So take out the list that you had with your ordinary objects on it. And what I want to do is I want to compile, as long as I can keep my hand from falling off, I want to compile all the ideas that you had so that we can make a full class brainstorm. That is not going to be lighting up on that camera. Okay. I'm going to keep writing. You're going to keep telling me things. What is that?
Oh, she wanted to do. Someone left. Chloe had to leave her game.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So I'm going to keep writing. You're going to keep shouting out things. I'm going to try to keep up with you. You're going to help me remember when I forget. Ready?
Doorknob.
Doorknob. Good start.
Tables.
Music note.
Chairs.
Chair. Music.
Paper.
Cup. Flashlight.
Note. I heard table.
Art.
Counters.
Flashlight.
Ladder.
Ladder.
Light.
I wonder where you got that idea. That's a good one.
Ladder there.
I know. That's good. That's a
Stool.
good way to use your
Lever.
surroundings. Stool.
Book.
Soap
Book.
dispenser.
Pencil
Cup.
sharpener.
Soap.
TV
Cars.
remote.
Car.
Clipboard.
Remote.
Faucet.
Faucet.
Whiteboard.
Cup.
Brush.
Alarm. Whoops, slow down. Clock.
Buildings.
Staple.
Brush.
Skyscrapers.
Staple.
Staples Center.
Dresser.
Water bottle.
Cup.
Kleenex.
Water. Bottle. Oh man. Kleenex.
Money.
Money.
Pencil.
Cup.
Pencil.
Bed.
Cup.
With a boom box.
Bed. Sure.
Chair. Milk jug.
Bench. Pipe.
Milk.
Camera.
Jug. Camera.
Dog.
Axe.
Dog house. I don't think I've heard that one in a lot of years.
Tree.
Tree.
Treehouse.
Sunglasses.
Sunglasses. Writing's getting worse.
Jewelry.
Car.
Birdhouse.
Computer.
Keys. Computer.
Windows 95.
Yes.
Phone.
Whiteboard.
Reader. Jewelry.
Windows XP.
TV.
Windows 95.
Windows 95. TV.
Windows 95.
What is it?
Is
Remote.
that an object
What is it?
Yes.
Laundry.
that has highlights and shadows?
Plays music.
Yeah, it's a computer.
Football.
Windows 95.
Laundry. Shoes.
Nintendo.
Coin.
Computer.
Did I just hear Nintendo?
Yeah,
Socks.
Oh,
Batmobile.
Shoes.
It's a can.
Candle, I heard.
Automobile.
Vacuum. Straw.
Straw.
Old school
Silverware.
Nintendo.
Old school Nintendo.
Silver.
Flowers.
Ware.
Yes, I do.
Sega
My
Genesis.
sister does.
Sega.
Back
Doors.
Nintendo 64.
Door?
The Super Nintendo Entertainment System. No.
Food. Vacuum. That's a great one.
Or video games.
Atari.
Lamp. Think about things that we don't normally look at.
Atari.
Oh, light switch.
Yes.
Light switch. There we go.
GameCube. Game Boy.
Hammer.
Hinge. That's great. Don't normally pay attention to those.
Hammer.
Hammer.
Wii.
Handle.
Fans.
handle,
The ball.
fan,
Soap.
Church.
soap, I got somewhere.
What kind of?
Sharpener.
Sharpener,
Eyes.
DS, DSI, DSL.
A Kindle. I don't know.
Kindle Fire Tablet.
What is suitcase?
iPhone, Apple,
Fixtures.
Samsung,
suitcase, that's a good one.
iPhone X, iPhone 8,
Drawers.
iPhone 7, iPhone 6.
Drawer,
That's what I was just thinking too.
Yeah. Phones.
Eyes.
eyes,
UIS.
A vase.
Blender.
vase,
Yeah.
sure.
Base.
Plant,
Boxes.
Bobby pin.
we got bobby pin, that's a good one.
Boxes.
Shoes.
Hair ties.
Shoe, we got box,
Music note.
music note, we've got,
That's like the third one.
What about jewelry?
Money.
Have to wear jewelry every day. Don't
Maybe.
even think about it.
Canada.
Ziploc bags.
oh, yeah,
Clothing.
Ziploc bag,
Michael Kors.
Air
plate,
You could say
Of course,
That's all I got.
Air vent.
rug.
Yeah.
air vent, that's a good one.
Ziploc, Michael Kors.
A rug. Steering wheel.
Steering wheel,
Cardboard box.
yep, box we got somewhere.
Stick shift.
Stick shift,
Barn.
that's a good one.
Yarn.
Barn.
Pole.
Barns. Yeah, like those
Yarn.
barns, we don't really.
Barn,
Drawer.
drawer we got,
Polish people.
Horses.
Stapler.
horse,
Really? Amish people.
stapler, did I put stapler up there?
Staple.
Staple I put,
Hat.
Hat.
hat,
Cat.
cat,
Mask.
Back.
be more specific.
Cat.
What about your
Back getting in.
lanyard?
Great
Toothbrush.
Lanyard, toothbrush is good,
Bat.
Lantern.
Deodorant.
deodorant's good,
I hope you think about that at least.
Laser.
Lotion.
What? Always.
lotion,
Shower curtain.
shower curtain, awesome,
A
Pantry.
I
rug.
went too far. I did fair.
Fire
rug,
Bears.
Closet.
closet,
Lantern.
Suspense.
A hanger. You have company.
Greenwich.
hanger,
Australia.
There's someone that needs
Pillow.
Australia, Mike.
a fire organizer.
clear,
No. Australia, Mike.
A map.
SNS. That's nest.
cassette, match, that's a good one,
Nest.
Fire.
mouse,
Paper cutter.
Soccer ball.
soccer,
Baseball.
Hanger of the glaze. Pole.
maybe,
Paper cutter.
Bowl.
bowl,
Spicy
About
fish.
a leash.
Dicey thing.
Remember they
Pencil sharpener.
there you go.
Dice.
Sharpener we've got,
Dice.
dice,
Die.
Like the crazy.
Dominoes.
domino,
Light bulb.
Die.
Light bulb.
Die. Like.
keep your list, we're gonna talk more tomorrow, thank you.
You put down pencil.
You put
I did not pencil now.
Julian Alvarado, Evan Beatty to the main office, please.
Okay.
Anything else while you're walking out the door?
Since I was 95, that's why I'm
I don't know.
Windows every phone.
Windows 95 are
Windows every phone.
We use books every day. I feel like I put book up there. Did you? Oh my gosh.
Those things are old.
MacBooks.
Yeah.
Is that really ordinary?
What? I want to 95. I see. I actually had
Windows
one.
95, yes, ordinary as a piece of software, but it's hard to draw a piece of software as a three-dimensional object.
It's a good start with 3D computer.
Maybe.
One side, 2, 3, 4.
Gosh darn. Okay, go.
takes,
Out here.
Windows.
Black thing, it goes.
What thing,
Yeah.
man?
Oh, right, I got it.
What am I?
Because she's gonna say, Luke, I want you in here.
Recorder.
Not too much today.
All right.
Player.
To be continued.
A DJ. Player.